350. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study, and particularly prehistoric art, is conditioned by a multiplicity of factors, from geology through social and political structure and kingly ambition to religion, mythology and cosmogony. Aesthetics is closely governed by ethics, while at the same time serving it. Moreover, by recording ritual, scorifications, hairstyles, costumes and scenarios, art often acts as a museum of social and even physical anthropology. Art defined as craft plus inspiration cannot be understood without history. Social organization often explains points of style. For instance, that the same artists Savant carve wood and ivory, while others work in pottery and bronze. The manufacture of ivory and bronze objects is in large part explained by a switch from one material to the other, just as the outline and external decoration of pots from prehistoric periods is only to be explained by their descent from plated straw baskets. Then there are masks, on the making of which Africans have lavished such boundless imagination. Babo masks, for instance, especially the three main types, Kili ancestor mask in the head of marabou crane and tribal buffalo skull are real personalities, familiar in the village. They are not only evidence of history, but contribute actively to the making of it. For The cowries described Iib and Basta in 1352 at the court of Mali were originally intended for use as coinage, but they also served as adornments, artistically strung together, and were specially important on social occasions and at religious ceremonies. Here art is an integral part of a whole complex pattern which gives it meaning and which at the same time it endows with life. To embark on the history of certain African societies without a knowledge of the rich language of cowries and masks would be like going into a library without being able to read. It would inevitably produce a defective version of their evolution. The same is true of oral tradition, which is discussed at length elsewhere. Oral tradition is history from life and transmitted by the collective memory, with all the garbling and lack of sophistication that this entails, but also all the freshness and vigor. Certainly it has its flaws. For example, it is often silent about economic and social factors. But even with its flaws it can point us to other sources which are often more relevant, such as manuscripts or archaeological sites. Indeed, before embarking on any program of excavations it is wise to set to work to collect oral traditions. It is also to help in correcting errors of interpretation that may arise from a purely external approach, and it makes it possible to limit the number of hypotheses. For the great oracle mask or spirit of God is Goge, and is guarded by a high priest called Aganola. The great mask plays an important part in the political system of these societies, which is virtually an extension of ancestor worship, operating at night in the closest secrecy. For meetings of the Paro the great mask is brought to the sacred wood beforehand, covered with a white cloth. The Ganola acts as headman and priest, and dispenser of ancestors' sanctified truth. Goge is also a legislator. Its decisions are promulgated in the village and have the force of law. Translated from M. Hoey's in Etudes Gibbons, 1951. G. W. Harley, 1950. 351. Methodology and African Prehistory. To narrow the spectrum of alternatives. 5. Where there are several versions of the same tradition, some other source, e.g., reference to a MP showing the areas affected by an eclipse, will make it possible to decide between them. Drums, which have their roots in tradition, are one of Africa's great living books. Some drums are oracles, others are broadcasting stations, war cries inciting to heroism, or chroniclers recording landmarks in the life of the community. Their language is essentially a message replete with history. In this connection some divide ethnomusicology into internal, technical musicology and external musicology, which is part of the social and cultural fabric. 6. The greatest epics and chronicles are often sung by groups organized for the purpose, and in a manner peculiar to Africa, in which the whole audience join, for music is never passively listened to, but it is performed by everyone who is present. What is happening is a collective celebration. The song, dance and music become a synthesis to which linguistics, history, botany, psychology, social psychology, physiology, psychoanalysis, religion, etc., may all contribute. Without exaggerating the importance of musicochronology, The comparative study of music and musical instruments by arithmetical means and statistical analysis can provide clinching evidence on the question of the spread and development of cultures. The world of African music is giving ground in the face of an invasion by other types of music, often less rich even if introduced by richer economic systems. Is the drum that has made history destined to end up in the near future itself as a museum exhibit? Linguistics is becoming more and more the partner of history, and a young, reliable, productive partner it is. For languages are a living museum in which tradition is preserved, and to extract the real essence of them it is necessary to possess the science of language. Every language is both a psychological entity and a social phenomenon. Its vocabulary, for instance, reflects the impact of history on a people. But conversely it is the language, the word, that instills a system of concepts and behavioral rules into a people's mentality and motivations. Some concepts are difficult to express properly in a language geared to a different overall context, as for instance that of Seneca in Monday or Rakier in Mole, roughly translatable as joking relationship, which plays such an important historical role in the 5. Obviously oral tradition must be placed in context. An interesting tabular analysis of tales and legends sets out in 9 columns data internal to the tale, e.g. semantic and stylistic, and external data, some within the context of culture and civilization and some outside it. See Literature Oral Arabo-Berberie, for e-Bulletin de Liaison, 1970, Centre d'études maghrébines, Musée de Lyon, Paris. 6. Working on these lines, it is possible to advance into many more specialized areas, such as the relationship between music and speech, the social and philosophical symbolism attaching to music, the links between rhythm and possession phenomena, the relationship between music and economic and ecological environment, and the relationship between the musics of different ethnic groups. Simha and D. Constant indeed. Martin and T. Yiannopoulos, 1973. 352. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study. Sudan and Sahel, or that Oigui in Monday, which by no means coincides with the simple notion of landlord, or Oiteksoba, rendered literally master of the land or earth priest, though these do not convey the meaning. The historian will be continually using linguistic evidence along with other source material. Thus, for instance, the date and origin of the circular ruins in the Lobi area were determined by the conjunction of several pieces of mutually conflicting and supporting evidence. A hypothetical Portuguese origin, based on a text by D. Barros, was ruled out by the line of the road supposedly used and by examination of the pebble dash coating, which turned out to be too fresh to justify an early dating. Then the Wheeli and Birutfur name for these ruins, Kolna or stables for foreigners' cows, was noted. The foreigners were identified as the Kalongo on the strength of the style of pottery found in the ruins, and finally an estimate of date was made taking into account the migration traditions of the peoples of the area. This is a practical demonstration of the decisive role of linguistics in interpreting a particular historical fact. 7. It would be a great mistake to confuse the phenomenon of language, which is cultural, with tribalism or the biological factor of race. The language of the Dagorba horsemen who invaded the Volta basin in the 14th century is probably lost, having been supplanted by that of the local Kursace women whom they took as their wives and who became the mothers of their children. Here we see an example of linguistic contamination at the expense, as sometimes happens, of the political ruling class. Ethnohistory, in the shape of the quasi-static ethnographic present of the functionalist anthropologists, is not real history. It has nothing to contribute to our team of sources, each of which is not static but a variable carried along by the tide of history. Besides, functionalist ethnohistory too often ignores material cultures and that general movement of produce which Leroy Gorhan described as the matrix of civilization. Barter trade across the Sahara, on the basis of salt for gold from the Sudan, superseded some centuries later by that of slaves for guns, may well have been the main factor underlying the rise of the kingdoms and empires of West Africa. Thus we see that a dynamic sociology must also form one of the principal strands in African historical research. It is not a matter of blindly shifting one's effort from one socio-political work phase to another, either in time or space. That would create more problems than it solved. For instance, to calculate the average length of rain, it will not do simply to extrapolate backwards from an average length established for a known contemporary period, that political and social stability or instability are not necessarily the same. Again, the preferential collateral succession, from brother to brother, in the Musi kingdom of Yatega would not produce the same average values as in the kingdom of Ouagadougou, where succession was preferentially in the direct line from father to son. In the case of Ouagadougou, the 7. C.P. Parenko and R.P.J.A. Bear, 1962. 353. Methodology and African prehistory average length of reign would tend to be longer and the number of generations greater. There are also religious factors to be taken into account. For the dynasties of the GN kings Ganmasu who were regularly chosen from among the youngest full-grown men, the average length of reign would be greater again. In other words, the chronological horizon cannot be determined independently of data from the political sociology of a given country. But even the concept of stability itself is not an invariant ready-made model for all periods and countries. Stability may be merely apparent, or be bought at a high social cost. In Ethiopia and the Kingdom of Ouagadougou, the elimination or deportation of unsuccessful candidates and of collaterals produced a certain stability, but at a high price in human resources which must be accounted for in terms of instability if a true historical account is to be given of the development of these countries. The natural sciences will also be brought into play to help crystallize the picture of Africa's past and bring it into focus. We have computers for processing certain numerical data. There are technological, physical, chemical and biochemical methods of dating, of analyzing metals, plants and foodstuffs, and of investigating livestock and its heredity, and there is epidemiology and the study of natural disasters, a branch of climatology. It is no accident that famines occupied an important place in African tradition, serving as historical landmarks in the same way as wars. Violence has no doubt played the same sort of part in the historical development of Africa as in that of other continents, but there are differences. On the one hand, the low level of technological development has lessened its absolute impact, whilst on the other its relative impact has been greater because even a slightly by one people over another in this field had heightened significance. Disparity in armament was probably the deciding factor in enabling the Assyrians in Egypt, the early kings of ancient Ghana and Shaka the Zulu, to establish their hegemonies. Statistics also has a major contribution to make, if only in helping to quantify facts that would otherwise be subject to qualitative distortion, for there is a threshold beyond which a qualitative change in social phenomena may be said to take place. The population of 10 will not have the same sort of structure as one of 10 million. When we speak of invasions by 14th century African armies, the anachronistic pitfall is to think of these forces in 20th century terms. Recourse to statistical data, even if only in the form of rough estimates, will help to show events more nearly on the scale on which they really happened. The study of African wars, moreover, is only of use to African history if taken together with that of religion, with which they are intimately bound up, for the art of war was partly an exercise in magic. To be convinced of this, one has only to look at all Burianti's fighting dress, covered in amulets. This custom continued down to the African riflemen of the First and Second World Wars. Physical anthropology too can help in the compilation of true history. 354. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study. This field has long been bedeviled with racialist myths based on outward appearances, such as the Hamitic theory. The only cure is the interdisciplinary approach, which brings together different types of evidence in the search for the truth. Clues to certain identification are furnished by prehistoric rock paintings, though it is important not to confuse lifestyle as portrayed on a rock face with race. We must not forget that certain types of skeletal deformation, such as the lengthening of the skull practiced by the Mangbetu, are related to culture and lifestyle. Hematology can help to clear up some misconceptions. It indicates, however, that even blood groups adapt to environment, thus demonstrating the decisive effect of habitat on race. Race can be understood only by regarding it, like most of history, as compounded of nature and culture, with biology as the link. African nature has indeed left its mark on history, and consequently, while we must avoid mere mechanistic determinism, we should never lose sight of environmental factors. 8. The specificity of the cultures and prehistoric development of Central Africa, as D. Bell de Hermans has pointed out, is understandable only if we bear in mind the lack of daylight in the jungle, a reminder to us of the influence of space on time. 9. Nor can we usefully consider the earliest inhabitants of the Nile Valley without reference to geomorphology and paleoclimatology. Degrees method. Thus the historian of Africa must take account of a wide range of interlinked and overlapping disciplines. HOW is to organize this united front of heterogeneous allies in the battle for the face of Africa that was. It is possible to envisage a loose association, amounting to no more than agreeing to COMMON objectives, each member of the group then being left to work according to the techniques of his own discipline, with a meeting at the end to collate results. This does not seem a satisfactory method. It leaves intact all the drawbacks of individual disciplines without taking advantage, if not of all their virtues, at least of the beneficial effect of their close association one with another. The better way is the interdisciplinary method, under which different disciplines, instead of merely working alongside, are grafted onto one another. Not only the overall research strategy but also the tactical details must be settled jointly. First the essential questions are agreed in rough list form, then they are split into groups according to the 8. Nature proposes and man disposes, wrote Vidal de la Bloch, but as P.T.I.L. Hard-Dieterden put it, is not what a bird's eye view of history shows us the most recent chapter in natural history. 9. Ch. Lefebvre, 1974, a forceful work in which the author discusses a unitary theory of space, physical, psychological and social. 10. Chemical tests on calcium, phosphate, pollens and proteins can help to reconstruct dietary habits, which in turn may throw light on demographic aspects and the period over which sites were occupied. Palynologists are aiming to build up a bank of African pollens. 355. Methodology and African prehistory. Disciplines likely to be involved. Checks or collation of results must be carried out at regular intervals, or even when necessary at the request of one of the parties involved in the work. The problems are then restated in revised form in the light of the overall progress to date. Snags or bottlenecks that come to light as a result of the checks are dealt with by crash programs or concentration of effort. This sort of continuous association or teamwork needs a director for the whole project or program, but separate leaders may be designated in advance for the various stages of the investigation, one of which will call for a linguist, another for a sociologist, and so on. This sort of interdisciplinary working will result in improving each discipline's techniques and making its attack on the joint research topic more effective. Journeying down blind valleys can be quickly stopped, and the maximum of useful routes and shortcuts can be opened up. Research of this kind, in which archaeologists took historians, social anthropologists, art specialists and botanists with them to their sites, would act like a gigantic trawl net, dipping both wide and deep into world history. This presupposes, of course, that institutes of African studies, of which a considerable number already exists, can adapt their structure to this way of working, and it presupposes above all a new attitude of mind on the part of the research workers themselves. What, then, is the object of the exercise? It is to give back to Africans a conspectus and an awareness of their past. This cannot be a photocopy of the original, but, in somewhat the same way as in Plato's allegory of the cave, it must convey an impression of scenes that were real in days gone by. NOW life is essentially integration and coherence, the grouping of differing forces for a COMMON purpose. Death, by definition, is disintegration and non-coherence. Life, whether individual or collective, is neither linear nor one-dimensional, it is dense, compact tissue. The recreation of the past, the feat rarely achieved by historians, is occasionally attempted with success, admittedly under easier conditions, by historical novelists. Teachers of history, economics, sociology and so forth would find a fruitful subject for joint study in such slices of life as John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, Andrew Balrow's La Condition Humaine and Thomas Maffolo's Chaka. Without turning to the writing of novels, we must aim at reconstructions of this order of density, for real life was even more action-packed than novels. Truth is stranger than fiction. Every historical process partakes at one and the same time of all aspects of social reality, and any reconstruction that fails to take them all into account will be, if not non-history, at any rate a different history, incomplete and therefore one-sided. We can, of course, concentrate on a single dot on the surface of the historical picture and make an enlargement from it, always provided that we remember that it is part of the picture, without which it cannot be completely understood, even as a dot. This is even truer of the picture as a whole. Major historical facts like Amande expansion in West Africa are the result of a conjunction of 356. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study. Factors, including technology, material equipment, trade, linguistic advantages, appropriate political organization and religious fervor. TOC has is often done to give undue prominence to a single prime cause, before endeavoring to portray in all their teeming profusion the parts played by all the factors, is to set up a conceptual structure instead of trying to recreate the past in one's mind. This view of history in the round is even more essential in the case of simple and relatively unified societies than in countries divided on class lines. A distinction perhaps somewhat facile has been drawn in Africa between societies with a state structure and those without, the latter, of course, being defined according to the rules of one's own collective experience. 11. This is perhaps to overlook the case of an empire such as Mali. It had no metal roads and no bureaucracy, and its rulers deliberately opted for the decentralization that the facts dictated, and the result of all this was that the real life of the majority of the population went on outside the state. It went on, that is, in the villages, which had been independent for centuries and were connected with the center neither by the juridical link of a feudal fief, the physical link of railways and motorways, nor the functional link of income tax returns and central or local government regulations. To ignore this is to condemn oneself to a simplistic approach based on lists of kings and princes, many of which may be known only for one or two high points in a reign of 10 or 20 years, and who are set up as arbitrary landmarks in the real life of the people. The overwhelming majority of African peoples lived as unitary if not totalitarian societies, in which everything was of a piece, from tool making to fertility rites, including the ceremonies of long and death on the way. In this sense, a society ruled by animism is as highly integrated as one governed by Islam. In many respects this was not a secular society, and to think of it as such is to jettison a large part of the facts. It is quite true that centralization also exists in such countries, but it is not the type found in the modern state. 12. Where it is as it were the price paid and the antidote for pushing the division of labor to extremes. For instance, among the Senu folk, where the men's secret society is the Paro, the Lobi, who have the Dairo, and the Daola of Senegal, initiation often played a key role, the whole life of the community being organized around it. Again, whole federations of villages may be built round the Commonwealth altar cult, as in the Samo area of Upper Volta and in the Igbo country. While productivity in Africa has remained relatively lower, there has, on the contrary, been a tremendous flowering of folk art. For people almost totally dependent on nature, any clothing was finery. The meanest tool or pot was covered with decoration. Again, bodily scarification to produce this C.J.J. Mackay, 1961. The author analyses economic, sociological and political aspects in turn in an attempt to define the model applicable to Soda society. 12. The episode related Ibn Battuta about the people of Bor illustrates this very clearly. The Emperor of Mali, having unsuccessfully attempted to assimilate them, in the end recognized their cultural independence. 357. Methodology and African prehistory. Sunken or raised designs fulfills the dual function of denoting ethnic identity and satisfying an aesthetic urge. Similarly with the iron coins when used by the Eldoam Kasai, Konyanka, Mbende and Koronko in Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia, they were at the same time coins, protectors of houses and lands, and the resting places of the spirits of the departed and the ancestors, and it would be a mistake to see them as limited to any one of these functions. To portray unitary societies of this type clearly calls for a correspondingly all-embracing history, the kind of interdisciplinary teamwork exemplified in the study of the KOMB carried out jointly by the anthropologist David Tate and the historian J.D. Fidge. A similar synthetic approach was adopted by J. Burke for his work on the social history of an Egyptian village. 13. The global approach means taking into account all external factors as well as purely local ones. It means looking beyond the frontiers of Africa and integrating contributors from Europe, Asia, America and Indonesia into the fabric of Africa's personality. The perfunctory diffusionism is not, of course, enough. Even when there is outside influence, it is modified by internal forces. The schoolman's adage has it, quid quid recipitur, adi modum recipiendis recipitur, whatever is received in the light of and according to the form of the recipient. Thus Asiatic rice was domesticated in areas where the indigenous African strain already existed, and similarly manioc where the yam already grew. African culture is a subtle blend of factors. It cannot be reduced to the arithmetical total of these factors, since they are not packets of groceries to be lined up and counted. African culture subsumes and suppletes its constituent parts, and the object of African history must be to give full weight to all the parts and so portray a dynamic development job/the whole. In other words, the interdisciplinary method should eventually lead to a transdisciplinary approach, one in which all disciplines are represented with equal right. 13. J. Burke, 1957. 358. Chronological Framework, African Pluvial and Glacial Epochs. Part IR said our purpose here is to give the general account of some of the changes in the physical aspects of the African continent during the Pleistocene and early Holocene or recent epoch. During this approximately 2 million years the climates and environments of the world fluctuated considerably. The series of momentous climatic events which occurred during this epoch subjected the northern latitudes of the globe on 4 successive occasions to the advances and retreats of ice sheets known as Jins, Mindel, Riss and Wurm. In the Alps river valleys and terraces were formed. The present coastlines were established, and great changes were induced in the fauna and flora of the globe. The earliest proto-human forms had diverged from the ancestral primate stock by the beginning of the Pleistocene, and the oldest recognizable tools are found in horizons of lower Pleistocene age. In large measure, the development of culture since man's appearance as a tool using MML seems to have been profoundly influenced by the environmental factors that characterize the successive stages of the Pleistocene epoch. The idea that during several episodes of the Pleistocene epoch the glaciers were formerly far more extensive than at present had become well established in Europe, and it soon became obvious that in these European episodes of climatic deterioration were of more than local character. Work in Africa, for example, has shown that the continent underwent during the Pleistocene climatic changes of far-reaching dimensions and, although these have not yet been correlated conclusively with the events occurring in the northern part of the globe, they are to a large measure tied to these events in a manner which has yet to be deciphered. The prospects for the establishment of a time scale for the late Cenozoic and Pleistocene have greatly improved during the last decade. Deep-sea drilling programs have given extremely valuable information on a more or less continuous sedimentary record of the events of the latter part of the Earth's history. The detailed and multidisciplinary studies carried out on the cores raised from these programs, the advances in geophysical and particularly paleomagnetic studies, and the perfection of the techniques of methodology and African prehistory, radiometric measurements, have all contributed to a reasonably well-established time scale for this latter part of the Earth's history. Much remains to be done in this field as the events of any one area have not yet been finally correlated with events in other areas. However, the chronology of the later part of the Earth's history is better established than that of many other parts, and even though authors still differ in drawing the limits of the Pleistocene epoch, due to the great confusion arising from placing the classical stratotypes of the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs within its sequence established from the seabed, the following is the classification used in this chapter. The geomagnetic timescale of the last 5 million years shows that the Earth's magnetic field has been alternately changing from normal to reversed. These epochs were interrupted by minor events in which a reversal of the general pattern of that particular epoch took place. The HE epochs are, from the youngest to the oldest, Brut 069 million years to present Matuyama 243 069 million years, Gauss 332 243 million years, and Gilbert 543 32 million years. The Gilbert-Gauss magnetic interval was characterized by a great deterioration of the climate noticeable in many areas of the world. See for a review on this subject Hayes et al., 1969. This cool episode corresponds with the base of the continental Nebraskan glaciation as recorded in the Gulf of Mexico, the onset of ice-drafted detritus in the North and Atlantic, and the middle Villafranchian continental fauna. According to several authors, WHO would determine the Pliocene/Pleistocene boundary at the first onset of climatic deterioration. This episode marks the advent of the Pleistocene. However, The adoption of such a boundary would be inconsistent with the boundary as defined in the International Association for Quaternary Research INQUA Congress in 1955, as it would imply that the faunal assemblages of the classical section of Castellarquato, Italy, should be excluded from the Pliocene. Since this section has had worldwide use in biostratigraphic correlations, the consensus is to keep it in the Pliocene. The boundary is rather fixed at 1 to 85 million years BP, corresponding with the base of the Calabrian and the Oldaway magnetic event of the Matuyama epoch. Recent work has shown that this was a period of warming rather than cooling. The first great Pleistocene glaciations in temperate latitudes occurred c. 700,000 years BP at the Brute-Matuyama boundary. This glaciation may correspond to the Alpine GVNZ. The Pleistocene, therefore, can be divided roughly into two parts, the later representing the glacial era and the earlier the pre-glacial Pleistocene. The Alpinus occurred around 120130000 years BP, while the WRM started at 80,000 BP. The latter glacial is perhaps the best dated and studied. It lasted up to the Holocene, fixed at around 10,000 years BP. As stated earlier, this chapter attempts to review the most salient physical changes that set over the African continent in response to the climatic changes of the Pleistocene. A continent of the size of Africa includes a number of distinct environments, none of which need have responded in similar fashion or degree to the great paleoclimatic changes of the 360 chronological framework, African pluvial and glacial epochs Pleistocene. The approach, therefore, is to review these changes within the framework of the present-day major climatic regions of the continent. These regions may be classified under two headings: equatorial and subequatorial belts, and the tropical and subtropical belts. Equatorial and subequatorial belts. The equatorial belt covers today the hot and humid Zaire basin of Western Africa, characterized by slight fluctuating winds, slight seasonal fluctuations of temperatures and humidity, and frequent cloudbursts and thunderstorms. This belt is covered today by typical rainforests. The subequatorial belt covers most of the middle parts of Africa. It is characterized by the prevalence of equatorial-type air masses in summer, and tropical-type air masses in winter. Winter is dry and only slightly cooler than summer. Most of this belt includes areas with abundant moisture to support a tropical savanna vegetation. The northern and eastern fringes, however, today support a tropical steppe vegetation. As a result of the fluctuations in rainfall in these belts during the Pleistocene, this epoch may be subdivided on the basis of a succession of pluvial and interpluvial stages. The pluvials known as Kagaran, Katmajan, Kandran and Gambleen are believed to represent the subequatorial equivalents of the four major glacial stages of the northern hemisphere, but this has not yet been proved. TWO subpluvial phases, the Makaline and Nakaran, have been recognized in the Holocene. The effect of the pluvials can be seen in bigger wetty alluviation and in the higher lake sediments or shorelines left behind in several closed basins as a result of the expansion of the existing lakes. The interpluvial stages are characterized by the expansion of eolian activity when wind-borne sands were deposited or redistributed well to the south of the present-day southern limit of mobile dunes, and when radical changes in vegetation took place. Several volcanic peaks in these belts show glacial features at lower elevations than the present snow line, indicating cooler climates in past episodes. In the following paragraphs, examples are given of these changes in some selected areas in equatorial and subequatorial Africa. Lake basins of East Africa, and in particular its lake basins, provides the type area of the pluvials and interpluvials proposed for subequatorial Africa. The lakes of East Africa lie within the African Rift system. Those which fill the lobes of the eastern branch of this rift, with the exception of Lake Victoria, lack surface outlets and are situated in much drier climates. In contrast, the major lakes of the western branch of the Rift Valley are filled to their overflow levels. It must be obvious from the outset evidence of higher lake levels in a 361 methodology and African prehistory. Highly seismoactive zone like East Africa must be considered as suggestive rather than conclusive. Possibilities of tectonic displacement of shorelines, modification of lake overflow levels and tilting of lake basins must be taken into consideration in this extremely unstable area. For this reason the concept of early to middle Pleistocene pluvials has fallen into disuse. Cook, 1958, Flint, 1959 ZU 1950. Recent studies on East African lake basins have limited the use of this climatostratigraphic evidence to the Gambleon pluvial where in places tectonically underformed sediments are recorded. However, abundant geological evidence proves beyond doubt that the boundaries of the main rainforests have fluctuated considerably in the past. The great forests of the western drainage basins have been a major factor in conditioning human life throughout the archaeological record. The famous stratified site of Old Away Gorge in northern Tanzania includes at its base a magnificently preserved vertebrate fauna of undoubted lower Pleistocene age. The climatic associations indicate a period of markedly high rainfall Kagaran or Old Away I. Above these are two formations, indicating respectively the drier interval followed by relatively high rainfall Old Away IV. In this particular locality a stratigraphical succession is known which carries the most complete evolutionary series for the hand axe, from the earliest primitive forms to all the main specialized variants of this tool type of the lower Paleolithic as known in Europe and Western Asia. The pluvial evidence for the Gambleon in East Africa is primarily based on high strand lines and fossil lacustrine deposits of three formerly contiguous lakes lying to the northwest of Nairobi Nakuru, El-Mentide and Baixado. Baixado has one high beach level of slightly pre-upper Paleolithic age which indicates that the lake had a maximum depth of 200 meters and probably overflowed across a nearby watershed. Since the catchment area of the lake is small and the modern lakes do not exceed 10 meters in depth, this surface is taken as an indication of past wetter climates in East Africa. In the rock shelter overlooking the modern Nakuru and El-Mentide lakes, a well-stratified site with a true large-scale blade industry was found by Leakey and Gamble's Cave in Kenya. The lowest deposit is described as a lake beach shingle resting on the rock floor of the shelter at a height of about 200 meters above the present lake level. The implementite fruit deposits lie unconformably upon this shingle, and consist of a loose deposit of ash, dust, bone and obsidian. The associated fauna is obviously of modern type. According to Leakey, the implementite fruits levels belong to the end of a period of high rainfall which he calls the Gambleon after the site in question the first to follow that of the latest levels at Old Away which contained a shoely and implements and highly distinctive extinct fauna. The classic work of Nelson 1931-1940 on the East African lake basins presents one of the best documented studies of the past fluctuations of their levels. This author describes high shorelines from Lake Tana surface level 1830 meters the source of the Blue Nile, and records 5 major shorelines too. 362. Chronological framework, African pluvial and glacial epochs. Plus 125 meters with a less distinct level at plus 148 meters. Nelson also shows that for lakes of the rift valleys where Abita, Longana and Shila whirling up and temporarily overflowed northward into the Awash River, paleoclimatological records of Lake Victoria show that the lake was low and without an outlet for a period of undetermined length prior to 14500 BP, at which time open savanna vegetation prevailed. The lake began to rise 12000 years BP, at which time forest vegetation first appeared around the northern lake margins, but for a short time around 10000 years BP the level may have fallen to 12 meters below the present level. Lake Victoria was full between 9500 and 6500 years BP with an evergreen forest near its shores. The level of Lake Victoria has, in part, been affected by incision of its outlet, but the former low lake levels as well as the pollen sequence were certainly independent of this factor. Butzer and others 1972 carried out a detailed study of the East African lake basins and gave the radiocarbon dates of some of the sediments of their former beaches. The events and dates of the late quaternary of Lake Turkana, Rudolph Nakuru, Baixado and Mahadi coincide to a large extent. Lake Turkana with a contemporary surface area of 7,500 square kilometers is the largest non-outlet lake in East Africa. Situated in a downward zone adjacent to the East African Rift, the lake is fed primarily by the Ombo River which takes its source from the western Ethiopian highlands. Butzer's work shows that the littoral, deltaic and fluvial beds associated with this lake had a level of about 60 meters higher than the present level at a period about 130,000 years BP and again 60 to 70 meters higher than the present level about 13,000 years BP. Between this latter time and 9,500 years BP the lake became smaller than at present and the climate more arid. Starting from this latter date, The lake rose again and fluctuated between 60 and 80 meters above the present level until 7,500 years BP, when Lake Rudolph shrank to smaller dimensions. This was followed by further higher levels at 6,000 BP. Starting from about 3,000 BP, the lake fell to its present dimensions. The evidence from other East African lakes as studied by Butzer and others, 1972, shows a similar lake quaternary history. The HECHAD and SUDD basins. The Chad Basin deserves special attention because of its location on the southern edge of the Sahara and the great surface area of the inland sea that filled the entire basin during the Pleistocene. The present-day Lake Chad is a relic of this old inland sea. See Morneau, 1963, and Butzer, 1964 for references. The basin derives its waters from Central African savannas. The present lake surface stands at 280 meters with an area fluctuating between 10,000 and 25,000 square kilometers, a mean depth varying between 3 and 7 meters, and a maximum depth of 11 meters. The lake is separated from two large depressions, the Bodo and Kurab, by a low. 363. Methodology and African prehistory. Divide, breached by the dry valley of the Bahr el Ghazal. The lowest strand line of the present Lake Chad, at 4.6 meters, would permit water to overflow into the 500 kilometers distant Bodo Depression. At its highest stand at 332 meters, the Pleistocene lake ancestral to Chad formed conspicuous shorelines at 40 to 50 meters and so occupied an area of 4,000,000 square kilometers. Intermediate, less continuous shorelines are also recorded. Grove and Pole in 1963 show that the great loss of the present lake by evaporation is largely balanced by the inflow of the Logan and Shari from the south. These authors estimate that evaporation from the Pleistocene lake may have been 16 times greater, so that it must have received annually a volume of water equal to 1/3 the annual discharge of the Zaire. Butzer 1964 states rightly that the ancient Chad Sea represents, therefore, an excellent piece of evidence in favor of greater precipitation in subhumid tropical latitudes. Unfortunately, the shorelines of the different parts of the basin have not been correlated. The 600-meter thick Pleistocene section which underlies parts of the basin shows the complexity and long history of this inland sea. In the case of Nigeria, Grove and Pole in 1963 suggest that a 52-meter lake stage during the upper Pleistocene was followed by a dry climate, with extensive dune formation on the former lake plain. Re-establishment of a stream network at a later date was followed by another wetter period with a rise of lake level at least 12 meters during the Holocene. It can thus be stated that two poorly resolved positive lake movements appear to have occurred prior to 21,000 years BP. They were followed by a long interval of desiccation and eolith activity until shortly before 12,000 years BP, when the lake began to expand again. The HE Lake reached the maximum level with at least intermittent overflows at around 10,000 years ago. This high level lasted until about 4,000 years BP. The upper Pleistocene-Holocene history of this internal sea, therefore, seems to coincide almost in detail with those of the East African basins. The sub of southern Sudan represents, in the opinion of the present author, another great internal sea which probably had a similar history to the Chad Basin. The sub is a defunct lake which is assumed to have covered the sub-region of the upper reaches of the Nile and to have extended beyond to the White Nile, parts of the Blue Nile and Bahr el Ghazal. The idea of the existence of this former lake stemmed from the irrigation engineers working in Egypt, Lombardini, Garston and Wilcox, and was elaborated by Lawson 1927 and Ball 1939. All were impressed with the flatness of the plains of central and southern Sudan and recognized that a small increase in the levels of the Niles would flood extensive areas. The HE Sud Lake was estimated by Ball to have occupied an area of 23,000 square kilometers, the area within the 400-meter contour. The elevation of Shembe, where the present subgrowth of the Bahr el Ghazal begins to spread widely over the alluvial plains. This area is covered by the Urnruweba formation, which has been recently mapped and which is made up of a long series of fluviatile, deltaic and lacustrine deposits. The highest point in this 364 chronological framework, African pluvial and glacial epochs. Formation exceeds 500 meters in elevation, and this far exceeds the lowest overflow point of the Sabalunka Ridge to the north of Khartoum, 434 meters, which is supposed to have formed the northern boundary of the lake. as has been pointed out by Segmismus Ridge lies in one of the major fault lines which bounds the southern edge of the highly seismic Nubian Massif. This elevation, for this reason and for reasons pertaining to incision of Sabalunka Gorge by later erosion, cannot be taken as representing the height of the ridge during the filling of the lake. Further complications arise from the fact that during high floods the Blue Nile waters rush into the Nile, causing a damming effect on the waters of the White Nile. Even though the history of Lake Sund is not known in detail, evidence of its extensive reach is obvious from the 380-meter beach skirting large areas of the White Nile. Like the Chad Basin, it seems to have been very extensive between 12,000 and 8,000 years BP. To the north it must have been 50 kilometers wide. Williams, 1966. The Lake thereafter shrank, and at about 6,000 years BP annual rainfall had diminished to about 600 millimeters near Khartoum, and the level of the White Nile had fallen to 0.51 meter above its present mean high level. Glacial phenomena. The former glaciation of Africa is closely related to the glaciers of the present day which, in turn, are dependent chiefly on the distribution of very high land. With one exception, the Atlas Mountains, all known glaciated highlands lie in East Africa within a few degrees of the equator. Altitudes ranged from nearly 3,900 meters to 6,100 meters. Flint 1947. 1959. 8 gives a summary of the significant data of these glaciated areas and states that the snowfall that nourished the glaciers was probably the orographic precipitation of moisture brought by maritime air masses moving eastward from the South Atlantic and, to a lesser extent, moving westward from the Indian Ocean. The altitude of Mount Kermulat, 0 degrees IOS, long, 37 degrees I8E is 5199 meters and the present snow line is at 4600 meters. The maximal Pleistocene snow line is estimated at 900 meters. Flint, 1959 A. Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania lat. 3 degrees 05 S, long, 37 degrees 22 E has an altitude of 5895 meters and seems to lie at present just above the climatic snow line. The lowest Pleistocene snow line was above 1300 meters. Flint, 1959 A. Mount Elgon, Uganda lat. 1 degrees 08 N, long, 34 degrees 33 E has an altitude of 4321 meters and lies at present well below the climatic snow line. During the Pleistocene it was glaciated. Mount Ruwenzori lat. 0 degrees 24 N, long, 29 degrees 54 E has an altitude of 5109 meters and its modern snow line lies at 4750 meters on the western Congo side and 4575 meters on the eastern Uganda side. Pleistocene glaciers extended down to 2900 meters on the western side and to about 2000 meters on the eastern side. The Ethiopian highlands are not glaciated today but the Samian. 365. Methodology and African prehistory. Mountains lat. By 3 degrees by 4 N, long, 28 degrees 25 E seem to have been glaciated during the Pleistocene. Nelson 1940 demonstrates to former glaciations in some of the peaks of this range. Altitude C 4500 meters with climatic snow lines at 3600 to 4100 meters and 4200 meters. A glacial retreat correlated with the late Pleistocene corresponds to a snow line at 4400 meters. Nelson 1940 also describes a late Pleistocene glaciation at Mount Kaka lat. 7 degrees 50 N, long, 39 degrees 24 E with a snowline elevation estimated at 3700 meters. Glaciations from other volcanic peaks in Ethiopia which at present lie well below the snow line have also been reported. Mount Guna lat. U degrees 43 N, long, 38 degrees 7 E MB Ferret lat. 0 degrees 53 N, long, 38 degrees 50 E and Mount Chilolo lat. 7 degrees 50 N, long, 39 degrees IE. The evidence is convincing that the equatorial and subequatorial belts of Africa were glaciated at least twice and that they were considerably cooler during the WRM. In addition to the glacial phenomena of some of the peaks of this belt, solar fluxion and soil frost activity have been found in Ethiopia 4200 to 9300 meters. According to Bwadel 1958, the lower limit of solar fluxion during the WRM reached 2700 meters. Glaciofluvial deposits have also been recorded in many areas of equatorial Africa. The deposits of Mount Ruwenzori have been studied by D. Heinzel in 1963 and were found to grade into the Gambling terraces of the Sambiki River. The Sambiki, joining Lakes Edward and Albert on the Zaire-Uganda border, possesses massive beds of cobbles, gravel, sands and red soil sediments which were alluviated together by colluvial deposits. D. E. Heinzelin shows that the Sanko and Lupemban terraces are contemporary with the glaciofluvial deposits of Mount Ruwenzori. Tropical and subtropical zones. The modern tropical zone of Africa has easterly prevailing winds and noticeably seasonal fluctuations of air temperature. The western part of this belt, which lies on the Atlantic coast, has stable trade winds, relatively cool temperature, high air humidity and is almost rainless. The remainder of this belt covers the great deserts of the north and south of the continent. These are hot arid regions with a great daily range of temperature and absolute maximum air temperature. The subtropical zone covers the northern and southern fringes of the continent and is characterized by having tropical air masses prevailing in summer and moderate type of air masses prevailing in winter. The seasonal temperature and rainfall differ considerably. Those regions with Mediterranean climate possess clear calm weather in summer and are rainy in winter. The Sahara represents perhaps the most salient factor of this zone. Stretching 366. Chronological framework, African pluvial and glacial epochs. For more than 5,500 kilometers from the Red Sea to the Atlantic and having an average width from north to south of more than 1,700 kilometers, it covers almost 1/4 of the area of the entire African continent. Across the whole of this area, the rainfall, though very unevenly distributed, is in places over 100 meters m/nm, and on an average very much less. As a result, no perennial streams are known in the Sahara with the exception of the Nile, which derives its waters from sources far beyond the desert. Such ephemeral and permanent pools as do result from surface drainage are of no more consequence to present-day human life than are the wells and springs deriving their water from subterranean sources. The Sahara consists of a rigid nucleus of Precambrian rocks overlapped by Paleozoic to Cenozoic sediments which remained stable for most of the Phanerozoic. It is only in the Atlas Range from the Gulf of Gabes to Morocco and in the Red Sea hills east of the Nile that a certain degree of crustal warping and folding took place. A similar crustal disturbance is also noted in Cyrenaica and in the subsurface of coastal North Africa. These folding movements belong to the alpine system of mountain building of late Cenozoic and Quaternary age. The Red Sea Range, on the other hand, is connected with the crustal movements and the spreading of the Great African Rift Valley. The greatest area of relief is that of the Atlas Massif, which has the highest rainfall. Minor elevations exist in Cyrenaica and in the Haggard and Tibesti massifs of the Central Sahara. These latter form two regions of mountainous topography joined by the low saddleback ridge of Tummo. The area has an average elevation of 2,000 meters, although peaks as high as 3,600 meters are known. Most of the peaks are made up of volcanic rocks which formed during a long and protracted period of volcanic activity extending well into the Pleistocene. Smaller areas of volcanic rocks are seen in the massifs of Air, southwest of the Haggard, the Odinot which rises abruptly halfway between Tibesti and the Nile, Mount Pater and others. At the present time these high massifs have an insignificant effect on the climate, but there is abundant geological evidence that the Sahara region was far less arid during several episodes of the Pleistocene than at present. The greatest force of erosion in the desert today, as it always has been during the long periods of aridity, is wind erosion, which is responsible for the formation of the great peneplains of the Sahara. The wind-borne coarse sands resulting from this erosion accumulate in fields which are known as erg, while the finer materials are carried high up in the air where they remain in partial suspension for long periods of time. The bare rock surfaces which result from the processes of desert erosion are known as the hamada. Basins and depressions occur on these surfaces. These range from small shallow basins to enormous depressions reaching in places as low as 134 meters below sea level Catara Depression. These depressions became, in times of pluvials, the site of alluviation, and when they were lowered down to the groundwater level, the sites of spring activity. 367. Methodology and African prehistory and lacustrine sedimentation. The large depressions lie mostly on the edge of escarpments but are seldom encircled by scarps on all sides. Because they form internal basins with no outlet, they were certainly formed by wind action. Views differ as to the geological history of the Sahara. Certain authors claim that it was a desert for as long a period as the entire Phanerozoic, wet periods representing abnormal fluctuations in an otherwise continuous history of aridity. Others claim that the desertification is a recent phenomenon pertaining to the present-day pattern of distribution of air masses. Evidence that the desert in the recent past enjoyed wetter climates is overwhelming. The evidence ranges from the pattern of distribution of animals to sedimentary features that cannot be explained except by assuming a wetter climate in the past. Certain indigenous Central African animals are known to have lived in the desert, and these could not have migrated there except via corridors of vegetation or water. Central African crocodile species have been found in waterholes in deep ravines of the Haggard and Tibesti massifs. The African mudfish has been recorded as far north as the oasis of Biskra in southern Tunisia. The drainage features of the desert indicate previous greater rainfall. West of the Haggard, a huge plain extends to a few hundred kilometers from the Atlantic, sloping gently from the margins of the El Juf Depression. In the past, this clearly formed the evaporation basin of an extensive system of streams. The lines of drainage leading from the southern slopes of the Atlas southward, of which Wadi Sadra has been traced for more than 500 kilometers, are significant. Here is a valley which in the past carried sufficient volume of water to remove the aeolian sands that today choke its middle reaches. From the Red Sea hills, some wadis are as much as 300 kilometers long and they drain areas close to 50,000 square kilometers. Any of these, Wadi Karat-Dabouching in the Kombo plain to the north of Aswan, is fringed by alluvial-friendly bedded fine-grained silts of more than 100 meters in depth. These must have certainly been deposited by an active perennial river of considerable volume. The extensive work on the climato-stratigraphic divisions of the Sahara is reviewed by Fonte 1963. Cites the work of Alamet, Chevallon and Margat 1965 on the classic basin of the Sahara, for which the following periods have been suggested, from the oldest to the most recent.